Temple University. This is Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with authors and illustrators prominent in American literature for children. The moderator for this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter, Professor of Children's Literature with Temple University.
Hello, I'm Jaqueline Shachter. I'm a professor of children's literature at Temple University. Welcome to Profiles in Literature. Formerly from St. Paul, Minnesota and New York City, and now from Otisville, New York, comes today's guest, Joan Lexau. Ms. Lexau, your books lend themselves well to representation in artwork, puppetry, and storytelling. Behind us are some illustrations of some of your works prepared by fourth grade pupils of Mrs. Pat Slavin, a member of the studio audience. They are for Maria, Jose's Christmas Secret, Every Day a Dragon, The Rooftop Mystery, Benji, and Benji on His Own. What do you think of them?
Oh, I think they're lovely. I think the children did a very good job on them. Drawing is one thing that I've never been able to do, and I wish I could draw that well.
Also, one of my students made this crocodile puppet.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I love that mouth. That is a great big mouth.
He was inspired by your book, a tale of African folk tales called Crocodile and Hen, and wanted to know if you could tell us what inspired you to write that lovely folk tale.
Well, I was on the lookout for folk tales that would be suitable for beginning readers, because beginning readers love to hear them. But there are an awful lot of them that they can't read. They're just too complicated in sentence structure and so on. And that one was very simple, and the characters were quite saucy. And so I just fell in love with it, and I adapted it for beginning readers.
Joining us in discussion with Ms. Lexau are Carolyn Field, Director of the Office on Work with Children of the Free Library of Philadelphia and co-sponsor of this series of videotapes, and Rosemary Weber, Professor of Children's Literature at Drexel University Graduate School of Library Science. It's good to get to know someone who's acquainted with children's books from two angles. For 4 years, Ms. Lexau was in the Harper's Junior Books Department. Then she advanced from handling the books written by others to writing them herself. For the last dozen years, you've produced over 30 books for young readers, which is quite a remarkable achievement. Wonder if you could tell us something about how you develop your distinctive characterizations and just generally how you go about writing a book.
Well, at some point, I'm constantly on the lookout for ideas for books, and they come from everywhere, even dreams. And when I get an idea for a book, I start making notes on scraps of paper, and I put them in a file for that book, and I usually work on several books at a time until I have enough notes, and suddenly the book seems ripe for writing, and then I really set to it. Now, the process leading up to the actual start of writing may take years, but for a short book, I very often write it in one day. And then I rewrite it and type it up and send it into the publisher. But the characters, well, I become each character in my mind as I write. I am every character. And I don't exactly know how they grow, they just do.
You were Crocodile.
I was Crocodile. I did research on Hen. I talked to a farmer's wife. I asked about hens fluffing up feathers. I was told, yes, that's quite proper.
Well, I understand you're also a photographer from time to time. We have some photographs that you've taken. I wonder if you could tell us something about your present residence as we see these photographs.
This is Main Street in Otisville. It's a village of about 1,000 population. It's a very quiet place. Now and then on Saturday night we have a penny social. That's about it. This is the church. It was 100 years old in 1949, excuse me, and it still has a beautiful pipe organ in it, stained glass windows. And this is the old parsonage, also over 100 years old, and inside it certainly looks it. It was also, both of these buildings were abandoned for about 7 years, so they need a terrific amount of work.
And are you living in the parsonage?
I'm living in the parsonage, yes.
Well, very proper.
And wielding a hammer, and
Do you do some gardening there? Compare your gardening in Otisville to that in New York.
well, in New York, I did what gardening I could. I grew tomatoes in the windows, and in a successful year, I would have tomato bushes growing all up the window. And now I have a former parking lot to contend with, where the topsoil has all been removed, and I'm gradually changing this to a garden, but it may take some time.
Carolyn, it's your turn to ask a question.
Well, I have a many-pronged question, which I've always wanted to ask children's authors, and I never got around to it because other things happen. But anyway, I'd like to know about your childhood and books and reading. What sort of books you read? Did you use the library? Did you have public and school libraries available to you? Did these libraries and books influence you? Was there a librarian or a teacher or some other adult that influenced you in reading and then would lead as an influence into your writing?
Very small. We lived in Washington, D.C., and she would take my brother and I to the Library of Congress because she wanted to read the hometown papers there from St. Paul, and then she would take us by the hand and look at the books. They had one of the original editions at that time of Alice in Wonderland on display, and she got a copy of Alice in Wonderland and read it to us, and some people would have said we were too young, but we loved it. And we also had one of these, a story for every day of the year books, which he read to us, and read each proper story for that day religiously. I was very angry that my birthday's item was a poem instead of a story. Didn't seem fair. But she read to us constantly. And then in school, I remember in first grade we had shelves of books. And the first book I read, all in one day, was 3 Billy Goats Gruff. It had a blue cover. I took it home and read it, and I brought it back the next day and told Miss Ray that I had read it, the whole book, last night. And she said, "My goodness, you'll ruin your eyes." But I loved reading. So did my brother. We read constantly. We read everything we could get our hands on. We read the backs of the Wheaties boxes about the Breakfast of Champions. And I didn't care too much what I read, just as long as I read. And I read the Bobbsey Twins and loved them, and I read Nancy Drew, and I read The Adventures of Nils, and
Well, I'll have to interrupt you in case people get the wrong impression. In other words, you were a reader, a helpless reader, so that you could afford to read the Bobbsey Twins and Nancy Drew books because you read other good things. So people, adults today, a lot of them think that it doesn't matter what you read as long as you read, and you can just read cheap things. But you have to have something else. You have to have good things to help you develop standards.
I don't know, those cheap things meant just as much to me. I'm sorry.
Well, they advance your reading, though. This is my question. Did they help
advanced
you
my
to
love of
advance-
books.
Well, all right, that's. But you're still a helpless reader. I cannot give that up.
Did you have a library in, were you going to school in Washington, D.C. then?
Well, I went to half a grade of kindergarten then, but I don't remember that too well. I know in St. Paul, we did not have a school library. Of course,
That's
in those
when I
days, I
went.
think few schools did. But we had books in the classrooms.
Sometimes this is the thing, Carolyn, the fact that you don't have any place where you can get much of anything, and the Bobbsey Twins are very immediately available.
Right.
Yes, and there were no neighborhood libraries in those days either. It was, the downtown library.
I'd like to ask a question. You've said that you become every character that you write about in your books, and I wondered, in looking at these, you're right up to date with what we would now call minority characters. I wonder when you do your stories, whether you're thinking in those terms or whether it just happens that your publishers choose illustrators who choose to do your characters as minority characters.
Well, now, for Jose's Christmas Secret, I got that idea because I was freezing to death one night. That's all about a family being in a very cold apartment. And I was in this very cold apartment, and it was a cold day, and the wind was coming right through the windows, and it was, I had just moved into this apartment. I didn't have drapes. And finally I thought, well, I'll put the extra blanket over the window, and maybe that will help. Well, it didn't. It still blew in, and I was shivering, and I was feeling very sorry for myself. And then finally I said, which I do when I feel sorry for myself, you know, I said, now this is silly. You're lucky to have an extra blanket. Some people don't. And that set me to thinking. But, well, now, what family would not have an extra blanket? I sat up all that night working on the first draft of that book. But then after that, I had gotten the general idea of the book. For some time, I did research about the history of Puerto Rico and about Puerto Ricans in New York City and so on, and then rewrote the story. And that helped me to become the characters.
Well, what about Benji, which is one of my favorites?
Yeah, Benji, I don't know. That came in the middle of writing a longer book. That just sort of came. And
did you know someone who'd lost an earring or was
No.
who'd often lost it?
no.
How about striped ice cream? Do you like striped ice cream?
It's not so much that I like striped ice cream, it's what we had when I was little, because there were three of us, my mother, my brother, and I. And so to please everyone, my mother bought ice cream that was chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. But of course, we each had to have each flavor. She didn't cut off the chocolate for me and the vanilla for my brother and the strawberry for herself. That wouldn't be right. She didn't want to spoil us. So we would each have to eat everything, but at least we got one flavor that we liked. And we had this once a month. We had a pint of striped ice cream.
Tell us something about your present and future writing plans, if you can reveal it.
Yeah, well, I'm working on a mystery, an I Can Read mystery called The Poison Ivy Case. And I'm working on an anthology of stories that were written around the turn of the century for children. And I've been collecting them for some years now.
For what age level will these be, this anthology?
The anthology will be, for a phrase I love, middle-aged children.
Yeah, middle-aged.
Do you have any difficulty writing to a controlled vocabulary? For instance, for this I Can Read mystery that you're doing.
Well, the I Can Read books are not a controlled vocabulary. They are simply written, but they're not, you don't have a vocabulary list. But as an experiment on my own, I decided to see if I could write a book with a controlled vocabulary, and that was Who Took the Farmer's Hat.
I love that one.
But I find that that's very often used in libraries as a read-to book instead of a child beginning reader.
I never thought of that. In fact, as a controlled vocabulary book, I was one of those who was I read it to children. Never even thought of it in that way.
No, I just wanted to see what I could do with a controlled vocabulary. And Go Away Dog is also very a pretty controlled vocabulary. But the I Can Read books are not. I know Harper's doesn't like them to be written controlled vocabulary. They're against it, just as long as they're simply written.
You do see a need for I Can Read books, don't you? Why? Articulate that.
Well, I just remember how excited I was in the first grade that I could read a real book all by myself. And I know that children still feel that way. So they need the books that they can read, not just the school books, but what they call the real books.
Right. You're absolutely right, because some years ago we had such a demand from the first and second graders who wanted a whole book that they could read themselves, that we did the book list, Find Me a Book I Can Read, which has been revised and reprinted several times.
Well, part of my inspiration for books for beginning readers, when I worked at Harper's, I met Elsa Minerick, who's done the Little Bear books, and she was kind enough to talk to me about them and about writing for beginning readers. She was a great inspiration for me.
Do you use children at all for testing your manuscripts?
No, children are such individualists, and a lot depends on the mood they're in, that I think that could be a great mistake. I don't test them out on anybody except the editor. That's the hardest test of all.
We have in our studio audience Mrs. Elaine Lee, who is a professor at Glassboro State College, and I think she has a question.
Yes, I have a couple, so maybe later we'll raise another one. I wondered about this book called Me Day. I was very inspired by it, having just read in the journal Teacher 4 myths about dialect, and I wondered what inspired you to write a book that isn't exactly all in standard dialect. I loved it. I thought it was beautifully done.
Thank you. Well, it's a funny way that book developed. CBS Records asked me to come down, And they said that they were going to do a series of books and records. And one side would be a song, and the other side would be a children's story. And they said, could I do a story that would go with Feelin' Groovy? So I got a copy of the record, and I played it over and over and over again, and I studied the words, and this story developed from it. And it turned out to be a story about divorce. Now, my parents were divorced, and I had been wanting for a long time to write a story about divorce, and yet I couldn't find a way to do it. But this one just happened that way, just working from the words Feelin' Groovy. And CBS Records, by the way, canceled the project.
But you got a book out of it.
I did get a book out of it.
And a record.
Yeah.
No, the record
Feeling
wasn't
Groovy.
done.
Didn't they give it to you? You don't tell me yet.
Well, they never made it. They never got that far.
No, but I mean, you have a record for
Oh,
yourself.
yes, right,
Feeling
absolutely. And that's a good record to have, yes.
Elaine, you have another question? Go on.
Okay, fine. As long as you brought up the topic divorce, I pulled this out where it's kind of implied.
Yes, that book came
Emily's-
after V-Day.
Right.
What's the
And
name of that?
Emily and the Clunky Baby and the Next Door Dog. How about this Clunky Baby? Where did you get that idea?
Well, it just, sometimes things just come and you don't know where they come from. But it just seemed right.
What's
And,
a clunky baby?
Well, of course, I never had a little sister or brother either, but I'm sure that if I did have at times, they would be clunky.
Clunky.
Birthdays are very important in so many of your books. Is it because it was very important in your growing up years?
I guess they were. I had never had that question posed to me. I never thought about it. Yes, I guess they were very important to me, very exciting days. I can still remember some of my birthdays and the extreme excitement.
Pat Slavin, you have a question?
Yes. I've read about 15 of your books, and I found that most of them are a simple enough story for younger children to understand, yet a couple are very long, like The Trouble with Terry and Striped Ice Cream, which I hope you'll autograph later for my fourth graders.
Surely.
Is there any way that you decide? You said you prefer writing, or you love the middle child, which I assume is the longer story.
Right.
The Trouble with Terry and Striped Ice Cream, for instance, which my fourth graders adore reading. How do you decide whether this book is material, whether the idea is material for a longer book, or something like Who Took the Farmer's Hat? Of course, that's a little extreme.
Well, after you've written the story, you can see how long it is, and then you know it's...
You don't decide ahead of time.
Well, you really know ahead of time because you know if there's a lot of material there or if it's something very simple, and you have a pretty good idea ahead of time, yes. Trouble with Terry is based on roughly on my childhood in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Tom.
Oh, yes.
May I ask another question? All of the books that I have read, except Who Took the Farmer's Hat, is written under the name of Joan M. Lexau, and Who Took the Farmer's Hat is written by Joan L. Nodset.
Right.
I wonder why you would use a different name when your name is known.
Well, that happened because when I started writing, after I had my second book accepted, as a complete idiot, I quit my job and decided I would write full-time and make a living at it. This is an insane thing to do. What it means is that you have to write, so many books. And my publisher said, now you're going to write, she realized what I was doing, she said, you're going to write more books than we can possibly handle. She said, you're going to have to. And she said, but if you have another publisher doing a book in the same season for the same age group, would you use another name for it? Because otherwise people are going to hesitate to buy them, to buy the both of them. And if you're going to keep eating, you better try to sell both of them. So I use the name Nodset because that is part of, my father had two last names, Lexau Nodset. Had something to do, he's Norwegian, had something to do with the family home that there was a family feud about, and it's a very complicated business, and so they all had wound up with two last names. And so he dropped it, the name Not Set, when he came over here, but my brother and I both used it when we needed a pen name.
Does your brother write too?
Yes, he's managing editor of the Catholic Digest in St. Paul, and he writes articles. And he was partly an inspiration for me writing fiction. I think it's interesting that he ended up writing articles, because when we were little, when the boys were busy doing something else, sometimes he would tell us, me and the girls who lived in our apartment building, stories. And we would act them out as he told them. And there would be such screaming and leaping about. These were all mystery stories with secret passages and treasures and so on. And the man would come up from downstairs and say, "Please, kids, a plaster is falling, and could you just take it easy?" But he was a real brain. And if any of you remember the Quiz Kids, he was a semi-finalist. I was
really?
Yes.
Oh, my.
I was not a very bright child at all. I didn't know much, and he ended up doing nonfiction, and I ended up doing fiction.
Mike, you have a question.
Yeah. In Millicent's Ghost, are you Millicent or are you Aunt Agatha? Both. I wondered about that because when she sees the ghost coming down the hall, I can feel that you once had that happen to you, or seeing a specter come down the hall, or imagined specter come down the hall, and I could. Maybe it's empathy on my part, but I imagined you had that experience, because I've had it.
Have you?
Yes.
I haven't had that experience exactly, but enough alike so that I would know how that experience would feel.
Also, about the word usage in Emily, Millicent, the thing about Annie McCazer, or however you said it, I wondered, would that be over a child's head, or what age group this would be? That's
It would
really
be
my
over a
idea.
child's head on the first reading, but children usually like a book to be read to them more than once, and the second time around they're in on it.
This is my favorite. I've read about 10 of your books, and I keep going back to Millicent.
That's nice.
It is very difficult, isn't it, Miss Lexau, to be a writer exclusively?
Yes, it is. I work 7 days a week at it, and I usually take work home with me on vacation too.
And your vacations are in Minnesota, are they?
Yes, and I usually go when the state fair is on. I've never gotten over that. I have to go to the state fair and eat lots of hot dogs.
Have you done a book in the state fair?
Not yet, but I've been planning one for years.
Tell us something about your first published book, Olaf Reads. I think that's clever how you came to write that book.
Let me see. Olaf Reads. How did I come to write that book?
There was an account of a newspaper
That's
article.
right. In Time magazine, they used to have a section called Miscellany. And they had about a little boy who saw a sign that said pull, and he was a beginning reader, and he could read it, and so he pulled, and that was a fire alarm. So I put that in a book, and also a chapter about he saw a sign on a basket that said litter. And I had always thought, well, what if somebody read that as letter when you read something quickly,
Sure.
you know? So I used that, and then something about the library and the sign, quiet.
I really feel as if you have a child inside of you, because you do understand the things that they have problems with. And the story about Millicent, about when you say something anti-Macassar, the child would think, Auntie, Macassar, it was perfectly natural, and all the things that happen. I just think that it's just wonderful how you can understand what a child thinks and feels. So you must be childlike inside.
I love the way one children's book writer put it. He said, when you're writing for children, you have to become a child. And he said, you'd better be able to get back.
Yes, that's lovely.
Thank you very much, Miss Lexau. It's been a pleasure to welcome the author of The Trouble with Terry, the Child Study Association Book Award winner in 1962.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure for me.